A lot of the negatives of the internet age are not necessarily governmentally inspired. You point out, for example, and again, there's probably not enough coverage of this, that neo-Nazis are having a wonderful time in Russia on the internet. Nationalism, super-nationalists are using it. Very ardent religious groups are using it. It's a great place also to launch hate campaigns or to go after individuals in a very harassing way. This leads me to regulation.
Yes.
One of the reigning thoughts in some quarters today is, look, don't screw the internet up. Leave it free. It will work, its self-regulation will work out its problems. You don't take that view.
Well, not necessarily, but I don't see any good proposals for regulation so far. I mean, again, I don't think that we should not necessarily reject all regulation in cyberspace because cyberspace is some sacred cow of the libertarian movement.
Right.
No, I think we should, we have existing laws on privacy, on libel, and many other things, which, there is no reason why we should reject them simply because so much of our public life takes place online.
Yeah.
But of course, we have to balance it against our inability to enforce some of them without necessarily rocking the whole system. You look at what now is being debated in the US, to me, again, it brings us to the question of shutdown, very interestingly. On the same day that Hosni Mubarak turned off the networks in Egypt, 2 American senators introduced a bill that will basically allow the White House to have a kill switch button on the internet. And they missed completely the irony involved that you cannot probably go around promoting internet freedom abroad while also sort of trying to have a kill switch button at home, because now every other government will say, well, if you have the same power in America, we want to have the same power here. And this is the problem with much of the talk about regulation. Here it's often in the US and in the developed world, it's often driven by legitimate concerns of companies and corporations and sometimes parents associations,
I was going to say.
But the problem is that the moment we give in and we pass those regulations domestically, you have the likes of China, Russia, and Iran saying that we want the same regulations. We want to secure our cyberspace in exactly the same manner. But in their case, of course, they will be using those regulations to crack down on political dissent, not to protect parents and not to protect children, and not to protect
so that's a dilemma,
the rights of companies.
But is there something beyond just accepting it that maybe you haven't reached the point yet of thinking what it ought to be? But let's take pornography, for example. Chinese are very concerned about it, which makes them no different than many of us in the West. And certainly the internet is vastly expanding the capabilities of pornography than before. Nationalism, particularly of a kind that uses all sorts of falsehoods to create pictures, might be considered to be a national security problem. Religious fervor, if it gets totally out of hand, is a violence problem. Is there nothing we can do about this? Do we just hope people get sophisticated enough to be able to make selected decisions?
I toyed with the idea of not only solving the foreign policy dilemmas, but also domestic dilemmas in one book.
Right.
But I thought I probably wouldn't pull it off. I mean, to me, the main issue of interest here is how do you go about promoting something as abstract and ambiguous as internet freedom abroad?
Right.
Without necessarily looking hypocritical because your domestic politics tie you up. It's not just pornographers, it's all the talk about cyber warfare and cyber crime. There is a lot of talk which, again, makes all the persecution of WikiLeaks and the companies that hosted them, again, it makes America look not in the best light. It doesn't, emerging from the WikiLeaks saga, it doesn't really look like a credible defender of internet freedom for many countries, right? So again, to me, the question is, what should have been done differently in the attempt to promote internet freedom? It's a short-lived attempt. The big speech that Clinton made is just 1 year old. What should have been done differently to minimize the number of traps like this one? that American policy, foreign policymakers will eventually fall into. And I think here there are a lot of procedural changes in terms of, how do you want to structure your internet, freedom work inside an institution like the State Department? Whom do you empower? Do you want to empower people who are extremely knowledgeable about the internet in Silicon Valley and who will come and be the best, social media gurus you can afford in the government, while being totally blind to the kind of broader geopolitical environment in which they operate? Or do you want instead to empower the people who have some original knowledge?
Yeah, to be concrete about it, you recommend getting internet capabilities and judgments made at the regional desk level of the State Department.
Yes, because I think so far they've done it in a way where they try to centralize all decision-making about the internet, in offices, artificially created new offices that deal with things like innovation or social media. And I just don't think that that's the right way to go, because again, it makes many of the people working on these issues unaware of the broader geopolitical context in which they operate. One of the examples I give is when the State Department reached out to Twitter in 2009 during the protest in Iran, and they asked Twitter to delay maintenance of their website, which Twitter unfortunately planned exactly during the protests. It was a high-level contact. And it was publicized. It was leaked to the New York Times. New York Times wrote a lot of nice articles saying that, well, Obama and the State Department really get new media. But what it did internationally was to create this perception that there is some kind of a connection between internet-enabled protests in Iran and the US government and the State Department. And the fact that there was this contact between the two led to all sorts of editorials in Russian and Chinese newspapers basically expressing fears and concerns that by using American companies, Washington will also try to install regime change in their own backyard by using all sorts of new media tools. Again, I think that was a short-sighted move, because not only did it make Obama look different than he wanted on the issue of Iran, it also triggered a whole set of counter-responses from authoritarian governments, who now became much more suspicious of the role that American companies were playing in this business. Some of them began cultivating their own national champions. Again, this is exactly the kind of short-sighted move, which was driven, I think, by good intentions. But they should have reached out to Twitter. They should not have leaked this information to the New York Times, right? To put it very bluntly. And I think the reason that happened is because there was a lot of short-sightedness, and there was a lack of awareness of the broader geopolitical environment in which these things happen. It's just one of the many examples.
To wrap it up, you are centrism versus regionalism as a place to be making decisions. You're essentially saying, if I read you correctly, that broad sweeping efforts to regulate or to standardize the use of these new technologies is probably a mistake, that we need piecemeal solutions as we find problems, and that'll happen more at a lower level.